The town had
Please
turned
give
her
me
away at
shelter for
sundown.
one night.
Margaret had walked the streets of Denver for 3 days, hungry, exhausted, with nowhere to sleep and no one willing to help her. She was 25 years old, and the world had decided she was worthless. She had arrived in Denver 6 months earlier as a mail-order bride, responding to an advertisement from a man named Richard Hartwell, who claimed to be a successful businessman seeking a wife. The letters had been eloquent. The promises had been beautiful. Margaret had believed that finally, after years of struggle and poverty in Philadelphia, she would have security and a home. What she had found instead was a nightmare. Richard was nothing like his letters suggested. He was a gambling addict, a drinker, and a man who viewed marriage as a transaction. He had purchased a woman, and that woman was his property to do with as he pleased. Within weeks of her arrival, the abuse had begun. Physical violence, emotional cruelty, financial control that left Margaret with nothing. When she had tried to leave him 3 months into the marriage, he had told her the truth. She had no legal recourse. She was his wife. She belonged to him. And no one in Denver would help her because she was the property of a wealthy man. But Margaret had found courage she didn't know she possessed. She had run. She had escaped his house in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on her back. And now, 3 days later, she was on the streets with nowhere to go. The boarding houses had turned her away when they learned she had no money. The churches had offered her sympathy but no shelter. Their resources were limited, they explained, and she should return to her husband. The women's shelters didn't exist yet in Denver. Women in Margaret's situation simply had nowhere to turn. As darkness fell on the third night, Margaret found herself on the outskirts of town, desperate and completely alone. She was hungry. She was cold. She was terrified of what the night would bring. That's when she saw the cabin light in the distance. Jacob Mercer was a wealthy rancher in his mid-40s who had come to Denver on business. He was staying in a cabin on the edge of town while he conducted his affairs, planning to return to his ranch in Wyoming within a few days. He was alone, as he had been for years since his wife's death, and he had made peace with his solitude. He was preparing for bed when he heard it, a knock, soft, desperate, pleading. Jacob opened the door to find a woman standing in the darkness, her dress torn, her face bruised, her eyes carrying the kind of terror that spoke of recent violence. Behind her was nothing but darkness and uncertainty. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I need shelter. Just for tonight. I have nowhere else to go." Jacob could see everything in that moment. The recent bruises on her face and arms, the way she flinched when he moved, the desperation that transcended politeness or pride. And he could see in her eyes a woman who had been through something terrible and was barely holding herself together. "Come inside," Jacob said immediately, stepping aside. "You're safe now." Margaret stepped into the warm cabin, as if entering another world. The fire, the light, the warmth. It was almost too much after 3 nights sleeping in doorways and alleys. She collapsed into a chair near the fire, and the tears came, deep, body-racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her conscious control. Jacob brought her water, food, and blankets. He asked no questions. He simply provided what she needed and made it clear that she was safe in his home. Over the following days, as Margaret's physical and emotional state stabilized, she began to tell her story. The false marriage, the abuse, the escape, the rejection by a town that deemed her a problem rather than a victim. Jacob listened without judgment, and when she finished, he made a decision that surprised even himself. "You can stay here," he said simply. "Not as charity, and not as a temporary solution. I have a cabin on my ranch in Wyoming. You can live there. You can work for me if you want. I always need help managing the household. Or you don't have to work. Either way, you have a place to go. You have shelter. You have safety. That's not conditional on anything." Margaret stared at him. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You don't know me. I could be—" "You're a woman who has survived something terrible," Jacob interrupted gently. "That's all I need to know. You deserve shelter. You deserve safety. You deserve a chance to rebuild your life. I'm offering that." The journey to Jacob's ranch in Wyoming was transformative. Margaret had spent 3 months being told she was worthless, broken, damaged beyond repair. But Jacob treated her with absolute respect. He asked her opinions. He listened to her thoughts. He made it clear through his actions that she was a person of value. The cabin Jacob provided was small but comfortable, a place of her own where she could sleep safely without fear of violation or violence. And as weeks turned into months, something unexpected happened. Margaret began to heal. She helped manage Jacob's household. She worked in his gardens. She learned about ranching operations. And most importantly, she learned to trust again, not just Jacob, but herself. She learned that her judgment wasn't flawed, that she hadn't somehow deserved the abuse, that she was capable of building a good life. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jacob spoke words that would change everything. "Margaret," he said, his voice careful and deliberate, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that this comes with no obligation. You can say no, and everything remains exactly as it is. You have shelter, you have employment, you have safety. That's not contingent on your response to what I'm about to say." Margaret's heart began to race. She thought she knew what was coming. "I have fallen in love with you," Jacob continued, "not because I rescued you, but because of who you are, your strength, your intelligence, your capacity to survive trauma and still believe in goodness. I'm asking if you would consider marrying me, not for security or obligation, but because I want to build a life with you, because I want to spend the rest of my days with someone I genuinely love and respect." Margaret said yes through tears, and they were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the ranch. What followed was a marriage that became a testament to the power of genuine respect and partnership. Margaret was not a rescued victim who owed Jacob her gratitude. She was a full partner in their life together. Her voice mattered. Her choices were honored. Her autonomy was respected. Over the following years, Margaret became known throughout Wyoming for her advocacy work, particularly for women escaping abusive situations. She testified about her experiences. She worked with lawyers to change laws that protected abusers while blaming victims. She opened a shelter for women in desperate situations, providing them with what she had needed: shelter, safety, and the belief that they were worth saving. Years later, when people asked Margaret about the moment Jacob had opened his door to a desperate woman in the dark, about the moment she had understood that her life could be different, she spoke with the kind of clarity that comes from genuine transformation. "I was desperate and alone," Margaret would say. "I had been told I was worthless, that I deserved what happened to me, that no one would help me. I was standing in the darkness with nowhere to go and no reason to believe tomorrow would be any better. And then a man opened his door. He didn't ask questions. He didn't judge me. He simply said, 'You're safe now.'" She would pause, emotion visible on her face. That phrase, "You're safe now," it saved my life. She would continue. "Not because he rescued me, though he did, but because someone with power and resources chose to use them to help me. Not out of obligation or expectation of reward, but out of genuine human compassion. Through his actions, he taught me that I was worth saving. And that belief, that single person's refusal to turn me away, that changed everything." When Jacob died at 83, Margaret was at his side. They had been together for 38 years. 38 years of proving that love built on respect and genuine compassion is the strongest love of all. At his funeral, Margaret spoke about the man who had opened his door to a desperate woman in the darkness, who had offered her shelter when the world had turned her away, and who had spent decades proving that his first instinct, to help, was the right one. "He called it an act of mercy," Margaret said, her voice strong and clear. "But it was more than that. It was a refusal to accept the world's judgment about who deserves help. It was a choice, made at midnight, with no guarantee of reward or recognition, to value my life as equal to his own. Through his willingness to open that door, he didn't just give me shelter for one night. He gave me a life. He gave me hope. He gave me a future. And through that gift, I have been able to help thousands of other women find their own shelter in the darkness." Margaret lived for another 12 years after Jacob's death. She spent those years continuing the work they had begun together, building shelters, advocating for women's rights. teaching people that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply opening your door when someone pleads for shelter in the dark of night. On her grave, 2 names were inscribed, Jacob and Margaret Mercer. Below them, simple words. She pleaded for shelter in the darkness. He opened his door. Together, they showed us that mercy is the greatest love of all. And in Wyoming, the Mercer Shelter for Women, established to provide sanctuary for those fleeing abuse, continued the legacy of a rancher who understood that sometimes the bravest act is simply answering when someone knocks on your door in the darkness and says, "I need help."